In this episode of the Project Management Podcast, we discuss how laws and regulations limit and regulate the choices that you can make on your project. Hello and welcome to the Project Management Podcast at pm-podcast.com. This is episode 403 and I'm Cornelius Fichtner. Thanks for joining me. Every project that you have ever worked on has had at least one constraint. Maybe your current project has a fixed budget, or maybe the previous one had to be completed by a certain deadline. But I am sure of this: your projects all had to follow laws and regulations. If you are a project manager who wants to become PMP or PMI ACP certified, then the easiest way to do so is with our sister podcasts, the PM Prepcast or the Agile Prepcast, and study for the exam by watching the in-depth exam prep video training from pmprepcast.com. The laws that you have to follow, they can be major laws like Sarbanes-Oxley here in the USA, the protection of personal data laws in the European Union, or the intellectual property laws that most countries around the world have. And if you work in aerospace or healthcare, then you will know all about rules and regulations concerning personal safety. But on the other hand, these must-follow laws and regulations could simply be an internal regulation that tells you that all rental cars must be rented from one particular company. So laws and regulations limit our choices and freedom to shape our projects. And to explore this in more detail, we have Jim Franklin with us today. He has managed over 500 million of government contracts in California and knows a thing or two about laws and regulations. Hello, Jim. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Cornelius. Good morning.
Good morning to you, too. Well, to get us started, please tell us, what is the difference between a law and a regulation?
Well, in summary, Congress passes laws that govern the United States, and Congress has also authorized federal agencies to help put those laws in effect by creating and enforcing regulations. So that's really the major difference, and we'll get into some of the key regulations that I have to make sure I understand on the projects that I manage, and that's some of the key differences right there between laws and regulations.
Right. So you said Congress, pretty much the government, right, all over the world would be defining the laws.
Correct. And, that'll be at the federal level for the United States. And then you also have state laws. You could also have local laws. And in each case, both state and local would have regulations to make certain that those laws get enforced.
All right. Do you have a simple example for us in regards to a law, maybe something that you had personally come across on your projects?
Well, I think the example that you give with the Sarbanes-Oxley, I can remember working many, many years ago when that law went into effect. And, that was because of some issues that had occurred with companies and not reporting accurately their revenues, et cetera. And within our organization, once that law came into effect, they put together some very detailed procedures. So as project managers, we then had to learn those company procedures that by following those procedures, the company was compliant with the SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley law. So you'll find throughout this discussion that there'll be a law or a regulation, and companies then have to go through and understand and develop procedures that the project managers then will follow. And that's where the internal procedures come into play within an organization.
Is it only the government that creates laws and regulations?
Well, like I said, if you look at the federal government has their laws and regulations, you have state and you have local. Being these organizations being regulatory type in nature, within the company itself, you'll have detailed procedures that really make certain that the project managers are following those procedures to then be in compliance with various laws and regulations. So that is kind of how I have, from my perspective, working with these large organizations, is they're so focused in following the laws and regulations to make certain that they don't get in trouble, because they don't want to be in a situation, for example, where they could get debarred from performing government work because they did not follow regulations.
Every project is really unique. Does this then mean that every project may have to follow unique laws, unique regulations?
Two ways to look at that. You'll have projects, if it's a federal type project, working for the federal government, we have to comply with the Federal Acquisition Regulations, the FAR. And those regulations will require that we perform, we comply with certain regulations. For example, project controls, they'll have to set up requirements to follow the Sarbanes-Oxley. There's estimating departments. They'll have very detailed procedures to make certain that you're compliant with the FAR for estimating, procurement procedures, contract procedures. So there'll be a standard set, if you want to call it that, of requirements that all project managers need to follow in order for the company and that project to comply with the FAR. Now, on the specific scope of work, there could be additional regulations that project has to follow. Maybe it's an environmental project where that project has to follow environmental regulations. Maybe the project is designing a building and they have to comply with the American Disability Act requirements. The project-specific scope, yes, there could be different regulations that you have to follow, but that FAR really kind of dictates those overarching requirements and regulations that all projects must follow in the case of government contracts.
At what point in the lifespan of our projects do we first have to think about and consider being in compliance with laws and regulations?
Well, in my experience, if you start at project initiation at the charter stage, looking at a key objective would be the project must comply with all applicable laws and regulations, and that would include, the federal, the state, and the local level. So that is a key critical objective that must be met, and then also a success criteria. And a project could be successful in delivering scope on time within budget, but fail miserably if they did not follow regulations. And then during the planning stage, that's really when you have to make certain that you are reviewing the scope of work in detail. You understand the scope and which regulations may apply to that scope of work. Include those as requirements. And also it could be a WBS scope deliverable, a regulation, that could add to that project. So the planning stage is so critical because at that stage you're developing or establishing the baselines, the scope, schedule, and cost. And as an example, maybe there is a permit requirement because of a regulation, and you do not realize that, you do not include it in your WBS, it's not in your schedule, and it's a 3-month process to obtain the permit. And you could see immediately you're behind schedule if you did not include that in the schedule baseline.
Yeah, my wife, she used to work in the pharmaceutical industry, and they had these permits that they needed to get from countries all over the world in order to be able to sell their pharmaceuticals in the country. And it sometimes happened that they didn't know how long it would take. So they could simply, send out the application, and then it was just sitting back and twiddling your thumbs and waiting until the foreign entity would finally give you your permit, and now you can continue with the project. So it was rather frustrating for them at times, not being able to have a clear end date that they could work towards on their projects.
Yeah, and that's an example of risk, that what you don't know hurts you as a project manager with respect to regulations. And it's the folks that work in the regulatory agencies enforcing the regulations and in the laws, they are very detailed. They know the regulations because that's what they do on a daily basis. So in the case of a project manager and a team and a company, you are at risk in what you don't know from the standpoint of complying with regulations. And in the case of the government contracts that I work on, we only have about 1 month to prepare a proposal. So we'll receive the RFP. We have to very quickly go through literally all of the PMBOK planning processes in a very fast track, short term. And you got to be careful, because if you miss something and you win the project, then you have a challenge of meeting budgets and schedule because of the fact that you've missed some scope in order to comply with a regulatory requirement.
Since you mentioned the PMBOK guide, can you give us some examples of areas where laws and regulations meet our projects here?
Yeah, in my case, again, with federal projects that I've worked on, we have, for project controls, that department, we have schedulers, and they're focused on making certain that all the documentation complies with the Sarbanes-Oxley. The estimating department, when we're working on these proposals, we have to comply with our estimating rules. And one of them, they call it TINA, which is Truth in Negotiations Act. You got to make certain that you've got pricing that is reasonable. You get bids from companies. You select the lowest bidder that is technically capable of performing the work. And then in the case of procurement, companies have to have approved procurement systems if you're going to work for the federal government. And they are a lot of procedures. They take a lot of time, but you got to follow them, because if you don't follow them, the companies get audited every few years. And if your project fails the audit, you just don't want to be that project manager. A couple of other examples, we, in many cases, we have waste handling and disposal on our projects. I work on construction type projects and then also environmental. And there are regulations that we have to comply with with respect to analytical testing, to profile the waste, and transportation and disposal. California has very strict rules on disposal. And then finally, I mentioned earlier the ADA, which is the American Disabilities Act. As a project manager, maybe you work for an architect firm and you're designing a new building and you do not incorporate the requirements of ADA into the building design. That would certainly get identified during the review process. And suddenly you're behind schedule because you have to redo the design. Your customer could be upset because you didn't comply with critical regulatory requirements. So those are some of the examples that I've seen in my career working on government contracts.
Yeah, and when listening to you right now, I'm kind of scratching my head here, because your experience is so different from mine working in the government. I've worked in retail, a supermarket chain, and also in a bank. So we had food and drug regulations that we had to follow in retail, and of course, financial regulations that we had to follow in the bank. So everything that you talked about, completely new world for me, but I can clearly see that we deal with laws and regulations as project managers that are really narrowly focused on our industry and the area where we run our projects, even if none of this, what you have just talked about, was ever applicable to what I have done previously, right?
Oh, that is so true. And that's why sometimes it can be a challenge for project managers to change industries. It's easier, I believe, when the economy is booming and companies are looking for project managers. But if the job market is tight, it's sometimes tough for a project manager to change industries because they don't have that experience that the companies are looking for. And if you think about it, it reduces risk to the company by having project managers that understand the industry, that have worked in the industry, understand the regulatory requirements and laws that have to be complied with. Doesn't mean they're experts, but they understand the process, and they understand which subject matter experts that they need to tap into as needed.
Yeah, I was just going to get into that, because it can't mean that we project managers have to know all the rules and regulations in our industry, right?
No, I think in my case, I've learned the regulations and the laws I need to comply with through PowerPoint presentations that my company gave. And then within our organizations, we have departments that have experts. So they could be the functional leads. And what's interesting is in many cases, those functional departments match the PMBOK knowledge areas. So you'll have human resources. There's all those regulations that you have to comply with from staffing. And then you're going to have the estimating department, the procurement department, the project controls or scheduling, each one of those departments become experts in understanding the regulations and putting together procedures and training to make certain that the project teams comply, because you have to comply. It's so critical.
Yeah, this is, of course, the tool and technique of expert judgment that we have now slipped into here. When does it make sense to involve these experts on a project to help ensure that we follow all the laws and regulations?
If you work for a company that is a government contractor, there's a good chance, a 100% chance probability that they have the systems in place. They have to. So to comply with the FAR and other regulations. Now, as I mentioned earlier, depending on the specific scope of work on that project, the project manager either has that experience from previous projects, so he'll have enough knowledge, or if it's a new type of project, there's a new scope deliverable that he's not familiar with, the project team is not familiar with, that's when he would have to go out and get a subject matter expert for that specific scope. But just the standard compliance with the FAR, contracts, procurement, estimating, controls, human resources, companies will have experts as part of those departments, and also they'll include procedures to make certain, as I mentioned earlier, that the project managers can hopefully easily comply with the regulatory requirements, the regulations.
You mentioned a number of experts already, and if I'm not mistaken, you haven't talked about lawyers yet. So expert judgment and experts, we're not necessarily talking just lawyers here then.
Yeah, correct. The companies that I've been involved with, I've been working on federal contracts now for about 26 years in San Diego, and we always have a contracts manager on our programs. And that contracts manager, their expertise is complying with the FAR, making certain that we have the procedures, following the procedures within the organization. Typically, the lawyers get involved, believe it or not, when there's a problem. And you don't want to have lawyers involved because that means there's a problem. So that's the preferred, what I have found. Now, we will bring lawyers involved. What I've experienced is when we're awarding a subcontract to a company, a subcontractor, and there's a lot of discussions on the terms and conditions, the T's and C's. Sometimes the lawyers will get involved with that. But again, the subject matter experts are going to be contracts. They're going to be subcontract administrators, estimating managers. And then for the specific scope of work, based on the types of projects that I've been involved with, it's mainly going to be folks that have knowledge of environmental regulations. I can remember we had a subject matter expert that his expertise was on transportation and disposal of waste, RCRA waste, CERCLA waste, and making certain that we collected the samples correctly, we performed the correct analytical testing, and the truck and where it ended up, the landfill, if that was the case, complied with California regulations. So that's a good example of a project-specific subject matter expert that we would utilize.
You work for a larger organization and, they have legal departments. They have all these people working for them and these experts that you can fall back onto. But some of our students, they may be working for smaller organizations, and it's normal here. So where does my responsibility as project manager end?
Well, a project manager is responsible for everything that's successful on the project or fails on the project. So as a project manager, you have the ultimate responsibility to make certain that you understand the scope of work of the project and all of the requirements, whether they're deliverable-based requirements or they are laws or regulations. And you have to find those experts if they're not within your organization. I mean, there are companies that have expertise in various laws and regulations that you could possibly tap into. There's also consultants that you can hire that have had a career working for large businesses and now they work for smaller businesses. But you've got to make certain that you've addressed all of the requirements of that project, and it's in the details too. That's where you got to be careful. You got to read every sentence, and many times you'll find a statement of work that you receive in responding to a request for proposal from a customer is they'll just have one sentence that says you will comply with all federal, state, and local regulations. Well, that puts the burden on you to make certain that you do your research at the planning stage and really at the initiation stage, because if you determine that you don't have the expertise and you don't have the ability to get or find that expertise, that could be a project that you decide not to pursue.
Yeah, I remember a contract that we had when I was working for an internet startup company back in Switzerland, where just one word made the difference. It was actually an error on our part. We should have used a different adjective there. And that changed the whole contract, that particular area of the contract. So we actually had to invest additional resources in fulfilling that particular adjective for our customer at the time. Didn't have anything to do with laws and regulations, but it was a contractual obligation that we had entered into. So that is a very interesting situation that I remember from the past here.
Yeah, as a project manager, when you get in those situations where you realize, I missed a scope item, I missed a key requirements, I did not include enough duration in the schedule to take into account maybe a review of a permit application. Those are bad days. So as a project manager, you like to avoid bad days. So it's just so important during that planning stage to make certain that you identify the requirements, the deliverables, have a really good WBS, a collaborative approach, tapping into subject matter experts to make certain that you've addressed all of the scope and the requirements, again, regulatory requirements, etc.
Mm-hmm. Let's take a brief step to the side here. What does the PMI Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct say about all of this, about laws and regulations?
Well, I was looking at the Section 2.3 and the regulations and legal requirements. There's Section 2.3.1 is that we as project managers, we inform ourselves to make certain that we uphold policies, rules, regulations, and laws that govern our work, professional and volunteer activities. So, the key there is you have to make certain you understand, you research, you bring in the subject matter experts as needed, but you cannot use that card saying, well, I just didn't know. Ignorance, that doesn't work in the case of regulation. So the PMBOK really puts that burden on the project manager. And I believe companies do a pretty good job in also taking on that burden to train the project managers. And one thing I do want to mention is, I feel that as a PM, as the leader, you can really help your project team grow by training them and making certain that you set the standard and the expectations that they, as a project team, we as a project team are going to comply with the regulations and the laws. And then the Section 2.3.2 focuses on, as a PM, you're going to report unethical and illegal conduct to management as necessary. And, we have that as an organization code of ethics. And the federal government, even requires that. If you identify an unethical activity, you're required to report that. If you do not report it, then you're guilty also. So the code of ethics in the PMBOK, I think, does a good job. It puts makes certain the PM understands that you have a responsibility to learn and understand and uphold, and then also to report if you identify unethical conducts.
Do you have an example for us from a project that did not follow rules and regulations? And what, if any, were the consequences?
I have a couple of examples. In one case, I can remember, it was probably 10 to 15 years ago, and we had a project. We were doing an environmental cleanup, and the project manager, the project team did not comply with regulatory requirements for managing and disposing of the waste that were removed from this site. And it became a big deal. And the project manager found himself in court. I don't know what the result of that was, but it had a significant impact on his career. He no longer works for the company. I don't think he really could find a job after that very easily. So that's an example of not complying with a regulatory requirement. I also remember some situations when we first started working on these government contracts. When I moved from Louisiana to California in 1990 to start working on federal contracts. And, there was so much to learn. It was an exciting time. And I can remember this prevailing wage, Davis-Bacon Act, and that requires that companies pay the employees a certain amount, a certain base wage based on the type of work that they're doing. And if we hire a subcontractor, they also have to pay those employees that Davis-Bacon wage or the prevailing wage. And the project manager and the project team did not include those requirements when they went out for bid. They ended up awarding a purchase order, and the subcontractor had a legitimate case to get more money. Project manager did not have that money, and it became a financial impact on the project. So those are a couple of examples that I can remember. In some of these government contracts, wow, we had a situation period where we won $75 million worth of work in 1 year. It was about 60 projects, and the company went from about 20 folks to about 200. And there was a lot of learning and a lot of mistakes. And fortunately, I was able to survive it all and learn some good lessons learned that I can share today.
Earlier on in our discussion, you mentioned the word risk, and I'd like to get back to that quickly. Just to be absolutely clear, laws and regulations are definitely not like risks, because I can accept a risk and not do anything about it, but I cannot accept and I cannot not follow a law and a regulation, right?
Correct. You would not want to include the probability and impact in your risk register of what happens if I do not follow a law or regulation. So you have to follow laws and regulations. That's clear in the PNBOK. It's clear on federal contracts. In the case of all organizations, you get fired if you do not comply. Now, where you can address risk with respect to laws and regulations would be, for example, if it's a permit application that you have to prepare, does your company have the expertise to prepare that application where it can go through the regulatory review process quickly and get approved? What is the risk of you not having those resources? If it's a high risk, then high probability, then that means maybe you have to hire someone to help you, or you hire a consultant or bring on board a new employee. There's also potential risk in the regulatory review. How long does the agencies take to review a permit application, as an example? And what are the risks? How can you mitigate that risk? What can you do to try to expedite that permit review process? Because again, when you establish that baseline based on, for example, you assume 1 month for the review process, but in reality, it's 3 months, and then your permit application was very poor and the agency rejects it, you can see that starts to have a domino effect on being able to deliver to your customer. And they get upset because you're suddenly not on schedule.
Let's take a look at how you personally ensure that your projects follow all laws and regulations. Do you differentiate in your approach depending on whether you are dealing with a law or a regulation?
I do not differentiate between a law or regulation. As I mentioned earlier, in most cases, many of those kind of standard policies and procedures have been enacted or set up within the organization. If project managers follow those, then we're following laws and regulations. For the specific scope, again, you have to really look at the deliverables and understand, are there laws or regulations? In many cases, in most cases, what I find is that the government will have specifications that are very detailed that we have to follow from a deliverable standpoint. So we're building a widget. That widget has specifications that we follow. Those specifications have been written, to then comply with regulatory requirements. So it's almost like a hierarchy. So as long as you're complying with company policy, you're complying with those specifications, typically, generally, there's no issues in doing that. For me, again, scope planning is the key, is what I will do to make certain that I identify the laws and regulations, specifications, et cetera, that we need to comply. And you have to go through them, as I mentioned earlier, with a very detailed. I've seen situations where a sentence could have a couple of deliverables and requirements and reference back to a regulation that you also have to comply. So it's a pretty big research project during that fast track time to prepare an estimate.
Do you do anything special in regards to record keeping to make sure that you sort of document that you're in compliance with laws and regulations?
Yeah, that's a great question. The way you demonstrate that you're in compliance is by documentation. So and I've been surprised in my career how difficult it is to train folks to document properly. or even to document. And there certainly has been a transition. The longer folks work on government contracts, the better they get at documentation. There's a huge risk to a project manager if you hire, for example, a subcontractor that has not been working on government contracts. They mainly work on commercial projects. They don't understand the documentation requirements. They don't understand the amount of documentation and rules that they have to follow. So you're at risk. So you have to make certain that those subcontractors understand that. What I do is I also make certain as a PM, and I think all project managers need to do this, is you have to set those expectations and standards to make certain your team understands that documentation is critical to the success of the project. It takes training, it takes follow-up, it takes mentoring. I can remember one time one of my team members, he was a construction manager, he was having a tough time using the laptop and Adobe and creating these reports. And, it was more of just a technical issue. So I sat down with him in a coffee shop on a Sunday for 3-4 hours, just showing him how to create the reports, how to edit the documents, because I knew that time invested was going to help me in reducing risk, because then he would be able to generate the reports that we needed to make sure we were in compliance.
This discussion about documentation, that triggered something in my mind, and I just quickly checked it out. I did an interview some time ago with Todd Williams about the topic of your project statement of work is missing a comma. And there we talked about the importance sometimes of reviewing an SOW and making sure that everything in the SOW, including the commas, are correct. And this is available for free for everybody who wants to listen to it. It's over at pm-podcast.com. Look for episode number 275. And I say here in our discussion, we look at the main reasons behind doing a formal SOW review, at the factors that show whether a formal review makes sense or not, identify some of the areas of concern during a review, and learn why a comma can make all the difference in the world. But this is more on a side note here, has less to do with law and regulations, but it shows the importance of ensuring that, your documentation is right and you really review all the things that you do here.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I look forward to checking out that podcast. One thing I would also add to that with respect to statements of work, we'll receive a statement of work from the government. That's part of the RFP package, and that's the scope and the requirements, et cetera. We will then prepare subcontractor procurement statements of work that will be part of our bid packages to companies to then bid on the work. You have to make certain that there's no inconsistencies between the government statement of work and the statement of work you create. And then for the subcontractors, and then we'll receive a proposal from the subcontractors, you have to make certain as a PM that you review their proposal to make certain that they haven't excluded work, they don't have exceptions, and their proposal matches the requirements in the statement of work. Because again, I've seen those inconsistencies where it creates problems. So very good points that you make. And again, I look forward to checking out that podcast.
I can see that dealing with laws and regulations takes time and it takes effort. Some may even say that it's wasted effort because it doesn't really improve the product, the service, or the result that we deliver at the end of our project. Do you agree?
No, I do not believe that it's wasted effort. If you're going to work in an industry that's highly regulated, that's the game that you have to play, and you have to comply with rules and regulations and laws and company procedures. Those requirements, rules, regulations, they do create a consistent and safer product, and it protects the resources of the government. I mean, we've all heard of those fraudulent cases and poor construction. You go to different countries and it's just appalling at some of the construction techniques because they don't have codes and laws and regulations to create that consistency. To me, the federal contracts can be challenging because there's so much you have to comply with. However, it is a rewarding career. And what I have found on federal contracts, what I've learned from the PMBOK, you can really really implement what you learn in the PMBOK on these federal contracts. On smaller companies, you don't have to, companies that don't really have project management procedures, you get the atmosphere of kind of the cowboy startup. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that can be a lot of fun. It just kind of depends on where you are in your career. For me personally, I've been working so many years now, I kind of like just to have those set of guidelines and rules to follow, and then I can just focus on the delivering the product, the service, or the result to the customer. I don't have to worry about trying to create procedures in parallel.
In summary, can you describe an ideal approach to following laws and regulations on our projects?
Couple of things. Again, during the planning stage, that's where you really need to focus on identifying all of the applicable laws and regulations that may apply to that project. And you need to document those as requirements and incorporate the deliverables into the WBS if that generates actual scope that you want to have as a deliverable or a work package. You need to make certain that you include some of the key requirements in the requirements traceability matrix. And that way that is front and center with the project team and understanding. You also want to make certain from a quality standpoint, when you prepare the quality control plan, the quality plan, that you include the inspections and tests to ensure that you are complying with those various regulations. I found that checklists can work extremely well. In the company that I work for, we have some fantastic checklists that we can use. So again, just to reinforce, make certain that you focus at the planning stage. It's got to be detailed. You've got to have the subject matter experts as needed. And if you're in a new industry, make certain that you're very cautious and verifying that you've identified all the various applicable laws and regulations.
Mm-hmm. And of course, all the students listening to this interview here, they are preparing for the PMP exam. And one recommendation definitely is, please do open up the Code of Ethics and read section 2.3.1 and 2.3.2 so you understand what the Code of Ethics says here about laws and regulations. Anything else that you could add in terms of importance for the PMP exam?
Well, if we look at the Code of Ethics, it's very clear that a project manager must uphold policies, rules, regulations. So when you're studying for the PMP test, just put yourself into that mindset for every one of the knowledge areas that you have to comply. There can't be any deviation from compliance. And then when you're studying also for the PMP, recognize in 2.3.2 of the Code of Ethics, it's focusing on reporting unethical or illegal conduct. And, the PMBOK is very strict on that. If you see any type of unethical or illegal conduct, you're going to report it. So that's also how you need to approach it, in real life and also when you're taking the test.
Overall, everything that we need to do, all the effort that we put into this, a tall order to live up to all of this and do it right. Can you give us maybe your top 2 to 3 tips? What can we do today, starting on our own projects, to ensure that we follow the laws and regulations and we give them the appropriate attention?
Well, you have to focus at the planning stage to identify them. So if you don't have that focus and you do not identify the laws and regulations, then you're going to put yourself and the company at risk. The project on government contracts, the project requirements from the government, you have to meet them. And the companies typically will have as procedures, the procedures to make certain that the project teams comply. And again, as a project manager and a leader, you have to convey to the team the importance of, one, following company procedures, because those procedures will make certain that you're in compliance with those standard government contract requirements, laws and regulations that apply to all projects. And then again, you've identified the project deliverable specific requirements to comply with laws and regulations. And you need to make certain that the team understands, you have a plan in place, and you document. So that project manager has to be that leader that, as I mentioned earlier, sets those expectations saying, team, documentation is important. We have to document properly, and you have to follow up as a project manager in making certain that documentation is correct. So that's a couple of things that I have found in my career, and certainly it's a fun career. It's a challenging career to be a government project manager, And I'm surprised that 26 years has gone by so quickly, but it's been a lot of fun working in San Diego on government contracts.
All right, before we close this out, is there a website where our listeners can go to and learn more about you?
Yes, I work for PM Mapping. That's my side business. And my website is pmmapping.com. I also have a YouTube channel, PM Mapping. And on the side, I'm an adjunct instructor at UCSD. I teach Project Management Essentials. It's the intro project management class. And I look forward to having some of your students attend that course. It's an excellent course, and you'll learn some great overview of project management, including some project planning techniques using mind mapping software.
Wonderful interview today. Thank you so much for your time, Jim. Appreciate it.
Cornelius, I had a great time.
All right, thank you. James Franklin is a project management professional with over 22 years of environmental and infrastructure project experience. He is particularly passionate about using mind mapping software for project planning and creating winning proposals, and has presented mind mapping techniques at numerous conferences, including the PMI Global Conference. Check it out by visiting pmmapping.com. If you are a project manager who wants to become PMP or PMI ACP certified, then the easiest way to do so is with our sister podcasts, the PM Prepcast or the Agile Prepcast, and study for the exam by watching the in-depth exam prep video training from pmprepcast.com. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening. Please visit pm-podcast.com for show notes, links, transcripts, and PDU information. Our email address is info@pm-podcast.com. And finally, we have this quick reminder of Parkinson's Law. Work expands to fill the time available for its completion. Until next time.